So 1600, Elena, are we online?
Yes.
All right. A warm welcome to today's edition of the NFDI InfraTalk. Actually, it's the 4th edition, so we are beginning to write history. And it is a great pleasure for today's talk to warmly welcome Grischka Petri. Grischka Petri recently joined the FIZ Karlsruhe here in Karlsruhe, and he's a research associate in the area of intellectual property rights. Of course, his main research interest is in the area between law and culture, such as given in his short CV on his website. And there you can also find that he has conducted a legal training where he spent stages at the legal department of a university, at a collecting society and a museum of modern art. And the combination of this is reflected by his membership in the NFDI consortium, NFDI for Culture. Grischka, in his talk, will bridge the gaps in between these different worlds, between culture, between law, and probably also between different other interesting topics. Grischka, a very warm welcome from my side. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jörg. And I'm going to jump into the void that was left by the shared screen. And this should be it. So if you see something really, really green and fresh now, then we're on the right side of the fence where the grass is, of course, greener than on the other side and not as usual. So good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to speak at today's InfraTalk. As Jörg has already told you, my name is Grischka Petri. I work at FIZ Karlsruhe, the Leibniz Institute for Information Infrastructure. And since this January, I'm part there of the legal helpdesk team within the Culture Consortium of the National Infrastructure for Research Data. Today, I'd like to invite you to a conversation on the legal entanglements of research data. The appealing title, of course, is a cover-up to hide the fact that I will be talking about legal epistemologies of data. And I'd like to start with a kind of jubilee. 100 years ago, a longer paper appeared in the Annalen der Naturphilosophie, a journal edited by Wilhelm Ostwald. Ostwald was a chemist and philosopher who had received the Chemistry Nobel Prize in 1909. The author of the paper was the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. The Logisch-philosophische Abhandlung, or in English, Logical Philosophical Treatise, is today commonly known as Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. In this treatise, Wittgenstein puts down a number of propositions, which he numbers according to their philosophical importance within his system. He starts by describing the world as all that is the case, and then goes on 1.1, the world is the totality of facts, not of things, and so on. For Wittgenstein, the world consists of a totality of interconnected atomic facts, and propositions make pictures of this very factual, fact-based world. In order for a picture, and this can encompass other media as well, he doesn't exclusively mean paintings or photographs. In order for a picture to represent a certain fact, it must, in some way, he says, possess the same logical structure as the fact. It is clear that however different from the real one an imagined world may be, it must have something, a form, in common with the real world. This means that what we're interested in, data, research data, are subject to certain intellectual requirements if we want to use them as part of our communication about the world. Wittgenstein explains that data need an adequate form. For a digital environment, this not only poses the question of the adequate format for data, it also suggests that some formats might be better than others in safeguarding the integrity of the data. Wittgenstein speaks of configurations, For him, space, time, and color are the fundamental dimensions, the substance of any object. Configurations are needed to picture the facts, and there may exist different configurations of a fact. He chooses a rather poetic metaphor to explain this. The gramophone record, the musical thought, the score, the sound waves all stand to one another in that depicting internal relation, which exists between language and the world. They all share the same logical structure. This structure is what is given to us. Given literally means data, of course. For the young Wittgenstein, the only way language made sense was to speak about facts, about what is the case, in order to make the underlying logic visible. If we return to the question of data and formats, this means that there is no such thing as isolated, unprocessed data. Arguably, raw data might be connected to an abstract unit, for example, an object's spatial dimensions or the position on a string of DNA. But any communication of that fact, the data, must happen as part of a configuration of what Wittgenstein calls pictures, which can even be configurations of language. More recently, this has been emphasized by Johanna Drucker in an article for the Digital Humanities Quarterly, Humanities Approaches to Graphical Display. Here, she distinguishes data from capta. Capta is taken actively, while data is assumed to be a given, able to be recorded and observed. From this distinction, a world of differences arises. Humanistic inquiry acknowledges the situated, partial, and constitutive character of knowledge production, the recognition that knowledge is constructed, taken, not simply given as a natural representation of pre-existing fact. Whereas the early Wittgenstein thought to have solved his philosophical problem by a logic restriction to facts, the later Wittgenstein realized something similar as Johanna Drucker by introducing the rabbit duck. In his philosophical investigations, published posthumously in 1953, he mentions it, the rabbit duck. Wittgenstein had picked it up in Joseph Jastrow's work, Fact and Fable in Psychology. And I show you the sources here. Jastrow, in turn, had encountered the rabbit duck in Harper's Weekly, who had copied the drawing from the Munich-based weekly Fliegende Blätter. It is a form that remains the same, identical, but whose interpretation is changeable. Depending on how I look at it, I can see a rabbit or a duck. Different constellations of meaning can be based on identical fact, even an identical form in this case. And Wittgenstein describes this as the change of aspect. This is when the legal perspective of research data emerges. The change of aspect is not only part of legal methodology, to listen to all parties involved and hear their different stories. It also connects data in a specified way with their social and political realities. Not only might one person's duck be the other person's rabbit, in a way of saying, a fair concept of the rabbit duck must take into account its mutability, its multiple dimensions. One could describe these constellations as legal containers, which have their specific legal consequences. In many cases, these involve other people and authorities having a say in the management of data, a kind of Mitspracherecht in German. To complicate matters even more, these legal containers change over time, as our idea what data means is changing over time. To give you but one example, photography was invented with the promise of being a medium of objective data collection. When Henry Fox Talbot presented it as the pencil of nature, he advertised photography as a medium that excluded human error in the image-making process. It was supposedly left to nature herself, the natural laws of optics, chemistry, and mechanics. Just the facts. Wittgenstein would have loved that. Of course, the concept had its flaws. Color was not part of the equation for a long time. Perspective and distance were the result of human choice, and even the subject of the photograph might be arranged. Here's one of the photographs published by Talbot, and the human arrangement is evident. New medium soon became a kind of legal rabbit duck. Photographers argued that they created works of art that should be copyright protected. Painters feared the competition and argued that this legal container was the wrong one for a medium producing nothing but data sets of the visible world. So that's how Talbot advertised the technology to the reader of The Pencil of Nature, which was published in different carnets in the mid-19th century. The plates of the present work are impressed by the agency of light alone, without any aid whatever from the artist's pencil. They are the sun pictures themselves, and not, as some persons have imagined, engravings in imitation. So that's the proposal, that it's a medium that creates images without human intervention, the pure fact, pure data. At the World's Fair of 1855, photographs were exhibited in the department for industrial products, not together with the arts. One of the first photographs to obtain legal protection is this portrait of the French poet Gérard de Nerval, taken in 1855 by Nadar. After it was copied as an engraving for the journal L'Artiste, the court ruled that this copy infringed Nadar's property rights. So suddenly there was a connection between data and property. And while it remained unclear whether photographs were protected in every case, it seemed possible that this kind of visual data simultaneously constituted a work in the sense of copyright law, or in the French expression, a work of spirit and genius. And other courts ruled on a similar line, like in 1883, the US Supreme Court, which came to a similar conclusion, ruling that photographs could potentially count as a representation of original intellectual conceptions. These questions have not become obsolete. One could say, oh, this is so old, so long ago, more than 100 years. But as recently as 10 years ago, exactly the same argument was part of a case brought before the European Court of Justice. When Natasha Kampusch escaped her kidnapper in 2006, after 8 years, Media Illustrated their reports with photographs taken from the posters that the police had published to search for the girl. The photographer, Eva Maria Peiner, a freelancer based in Vienna who had taken the pictures at Natasha Kampusch's kindergarten, sued the newspapers, and the case ended up at the European Court of Justice. The court had to decide about the originality of the photograph. And I quote from the decision: "Copyright is liable to apply only in relation to a photograph which is original, in the sense that it is its author's own intellectual creation, if it reflects the author's personality. That is the case if the author was able to express his creative abilities in the production of the work by making free and creative choices." And the court goes on. In the preparation phase, the photographer can choose the background, the subject's pose, and the lighting. Sorry. When taking a portrait photograph, he can choose the framing, the angle of view, and the atmosphere created. Finally, when selecting the snapshot, the photographer may choose from a variety of developing techniques, the one he wishes to adopt, or, where appropriate, use computer software. So that is a long list of potential creative choices that turn a photograph into an original creative work of art. Indeed, the raw data from Talbot's pencil of nature has evolved into a creative instrument, even in the eyes of the law. Or one could argue that something that started as a technology, photography, has become a medium. The better that technology is under control by a potentially creative process. And this creative element in the visualization of data is perhaps more common than commonly estimated. 2 years ago, the first picture of a black hole became global news. It was quite a sensation. Several media described it as a photograph, which is not, at least in a more precise understanding of what photography is. It is, however, a visualization that operates with photographic expectations of the public. With a view to the role of creative decision, it can count as a copyrightable work of art. The lines between technology and medium, between data use and creativity, are not set in stone. Science fiction gives us an idea of this potential transgression. In this low-budget production from 2010, it was a really, really bad movie, I have to tell you. In this low-budget production, an American geneticist and his daughter are hired by the US Navy to create a new weapon, a genetically engineered intelligent shark that has the tentacles of an octopus. So that's exactly where this transgression from technology into a kind of medium or instrumentalization happens. As historically in the case of photography, the line between data processing and creative manipulation is crossed. And the more we master data and progress from observation to creation, data becomes elements of innovation and creativity, and thus becomes it turns into a different legal container. Admittedly, we are not quite there yet, but in some areas we have already left the cruising altitude. And true to the multiple aspect of our rabbit duck and the idea that a picture enables our understanding of the facts of the world, photography has both become a potential work of art, but never ceased to serve as a recording medium of the facts of the world. Face recognition is one example of a technology making use of this photographic quality. I would like to propose yet another dimension for research data beyond data and capta. And this is the point of data also being multiplicanda, to be multiplied, to be copied, to be passed on. This is the basic framing of the research data infrastructure, to save and process data, which are to be multiplied in order to enlighten us in different contexts. These contexts are subject to specific legal regimes and their connected ethical territories. In many cases, related questions can push researchers to different sides of an argument. These legal regimes demand a process of negotiation to find the best balance of legitimate interests. The protection of personal data might inhibit research, but the price of breaching that protection can be too high. In other cases, law enforcement authorities break confidentiality by seizing research data. So that's exactly the other way around. Regulations for the protections of biodiversity can be perceived as so bureaucratic that they actually hinder what they claim to preserve. It's something we heard of in detail at the previous InfraTalk. The FAIR principles are a legitimate interest that is and should be part of such a legal equation. While the last slide gave an impression of varied legal regimes that have an impact on data-driven research, This slide indicates legal consequences of the shape of the different legal containers. So to speak, the containers that data can be shipped in. You sense that I'm coming already to the end of this little talk. Data can be personal, which involves the consent of the individuals involved. You could look at this chart as an indication of people who have a say in the use of data, the Mitspracherecht that I mentioned before. They have a legal right to be heard in these legal contexts. It sounds more friendly to look at it as the beginning of a legal conversation, which is what I'd like to propose here. Inventions, for example, require us to talk to those patent holders. If a data set constitutes a work in the sense of copyright, we will have to think about licenses or legitimate copyright exceptions. If we use trademarks, for example, in a comparative analysis of business strategies, we will at least have to take them into account. Since 2019, trade secrets are protected by the relevant laws. And last but not least, data can be embodied in objects, which are kept under control by their owners, such as this sheet of Mozart music, which was auctioned off a couple of weeks ago for a couple of €100,000. Predominantly, the works are affected by an additional layer of legal control here, and that comes attached to what I call the perception interface. This is not a legal term, but explains what it is about. The perception of creative data needs a transmitter. This can be media, such as books, photographs, films, CDs, and other disk formats, to mention just a few examples. All these are protected by so-called related rights, the relation being copyright law. Performing artists are protected under similar regulations, for example, dancers, actors, and musicians. Last but not least, researchers and scholars' work can not only be copyright protected as an original work, but also under related rights, for example, for the addition of a historic source. Just let us remember the black hole picture here. However, this personal relation between researchers and their data is not universal. It is restricted to specific legal containers. Pure data are not subject to copyright law. This means data that don't come in the shape of a work, in the legal container of a work. Basic academic principles demand the acknowledgement of sources, which includes data provenance and those researchers who captured the data. Beyond this ethical practice and the law, institutions and researchers occasionally restrict access and try to control data that they regard as theirs. It reminds me of the narrative of Columbus discovering America, taking possession of it. It is a concept that was not shared by the First Nations in America, and we shouldn't run the risk of data colonization here. There's another, in my view, better role model for data sharing, the 18th century Swedish botanist, zoologist, taxonomist, and physician Carl von Linné. His system of nature established a vocabulary that enabled a learned international communication about nature and its species across European languages. Under current law, his compilation, if processed digitally, would enjoy the protection as a database, which is another related right. We should not duck away from these questions. The law allows and prescribes different perspectives on research data. They can be debated, but they cannot be ignored. When this banana duck was posted on Reddit in 2016, one of the funniest comments was, "I see a rabbit." And with this remark, I'd like to conclude and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Grischka, for the very nice presentation and the overview of this topic, and also for the nice illustrated pictures all along the way, which made the presentation even more consumptionable. I'm looking forward to learn more about ducks and rabbits and to discuss the concepts. So I would like to warmly welcome all the participants of today's InfraTalk to our discussion. And for the discussion, I'd like to introduce Eva Lübke again as our moderator. Eva, please take over.
Thank you so much. Again, let me express our gratitude for this great talk and for describing the main concepts which lay behind copyright. I would suggest that we use the chat as our main tool for organizing the discussion because it's the most easiest way to collect all the questions and remarks. So please type a Q in case you have a question or a remark. Alternatively, you can also type down your question, whatever prefers you, but it's more vivid if you also turn on your mic and ask your question orally. So, who's the first one contributing to the discussion? Who has a question?
I'm not an expert on neither ducks nor rabbits, I have to admit.
So there's Jörg. You raised your hand.
Yeah. Okay. So here's my icebreaker question. So thanks for coming back all the way the history from Wittgenstein until today. I'm a newbie in legal aspects, and so please forgive if my question is maybe too trivial from your perspective. I was wondering, given now that we have the digital age and the digital transformation and data coming in new contexts, as you also provided examples, I was wondering, what would you foresee as the biggest breakthrough that we can achieve in this area to make the NFDI happen? This might also seem like a very big question, but maybe from the perspective that you sketched, like we are having this background on what is a work and what is an object which can be treated as such. And now that we have these artificial objects which we want to treat as such, and maybe this is a trivial question, and you just say, well, just do it as we did before and we are safe. But maybe it's also like, oh no, this will be a complete game changer and we have to reinvent the whole legal system.
Yeah, and the wheel.
And probably the answer is in between. So yeah, please.
Yeah, it's probably the, as we say in German, the thickest plank to drill here, because lawyers and legal people tend to decide and to balance interests according to what they know, and this also informs digital law. In many cases, data are just handled as objects would be handled. And perhaps the most impressive proof of this are the non-fungible tokens at the moment, the NFTs that turn the art market upside down. They are basically certificates to make data unique again. It sounds like a Trumpian phrase, make data unique again. But this is exactly what happens. And by that, the art market can treat digital data just as they would treat any good old object. So there's the underlying principle of ownership. And this is debated under the headlines of data ownership, also legally, in view of privacy and personality rights, for example, from the perspective of nations. Data sovereignty is a concept, and all these concepts go back to legal concepts of ownership and things that are older than digital data. So my wish, and I think we have to go along that way, and it is a difficult way because it requires us to enable other new modes of thinking that leave an object-based methodology and an object-based legal theory behind. But so far we experience just the other way from market forces that go back to what we know, what is established. And this is all happening under the paradigm of ownership and objects. So to break that up, that is the big project in my view. And we need to develop legal means to control this this process. I see a question.
Okay, thank you. Bernhard Miller from Consort SWD has the next question.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your very much inspiring talk. I think I have a pretty practical, down-to-earth question, and then one more that probably invites extrapolation. I was intrigued by the idea, or by the story you sketched, sort of how the photograph changed in nature from a sort of technical reproduction of presumed reality to some more artistic entity. Now, the very practical question would be if that sort of is generalized to data and sort of, as you sketched, they are in sort of certain boxes. How do I deal with the fact that a given set of, let's call it data, changes its nature over time? Do you propose, shall we start, documenting the perceptions, the societal reception, how to go about this? I mean, there has to be a practical way to conserve for the future users the way this sort of entity was intended. So that's the practical question. And the other question, sort of that, actually your comment about freedom of information legislation triggered that thought, but you also alluded to the point when you were talking about those funny non-fungible tokens. The question is, are we in the process of changing sort of perspectives on ownership? I wouldn't, maybe freedom of information is one aspect. I tend to associate the sharing economy more closely with a similar set of attitudes where people do not care as much about ownership as they might have done in the past. So do you want to extrapolate what that might mean for data? Thank you.
Thank you. I guess we could spend the next couple of hours talking about your questions. If I start from the end, the sharing culture is something that I see happening in small steps within cultural institutions that is negotiated under the headline of losing or loosening control. So if you have an archive, a library, a museum, for example, any public institution that is based on ownership of something, mostly objects, and their dissemination through reproductions. The old school thought is to use the copyright paradigms and control by licenses of this material. Now that this has, and it's a bit of a cultural rabbit duck here, because you can look at these objects in public collections as objects. You can look on them as information, pieces of information, data sets, and then they become subject to the freedom of information laws. That's not a path that has been really legally trodden. So no one has tried to get out reproductions from a museum by arguing that this should happen under the Freedom of Information Act or something. But it is potentially a way to do that. So by looking at artifacts as data and sets of information, yet something is happening, and this is the insight that under modern economics of a kind of economy of attention, it serves the cultural purpose to share this kind of data about the object. So it is counterintuitive for old school curators, for example, that they give up control to gain insights. I mean, this enables citizen science and a lot of other participation options. And this is happening slowly, more slowly than one might wish, coming from the wish to share data, also cultural data, but it is at least happening. Some beacons, international beacons have started, such as the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam and the Metropolitan Museum in New York, for example. And they not only look at their objects as objects, but also as a way to share data and knowledge about these objects. So that would be a slightly maybe more optimistic answer to your second question. The first one is, I think, even more complicated because there are at least two answers to it, true to the rabbit duck paradigm, that there's always two aspects to look at things. From the perspective of cultural history, yes, I'd agree that one should record all these instances of different understandings of technologies, both as technology and as media, such as photographs. And it is complicated. I mean, and it's a discussion that is not entirely solved. Photography is ubiquitous, and just by looking at what happens on Instagram, you could argue that is this a document of something, of social facts? Is this an aesthetic presentation of whatever, an artificial concept? And I think for culture and social sciences, the way to look at this is to look at it as a complex thing. So it can be both. I mean, this is the whole sense of that story, that some technologies move between different paradigms of documentation in this case, and artificial creation on the other side. And I only wanted to point out that this is not restricted to photographs, but can happen in other areas as well. The legal answer is a bit more down to earth and perhaps a little less exciting intellectually, because as I mentioned, the legal concepts they look at these developments in hindsight. So it took, for example, copyright law more than 150 years just to give photographs the default identical status of a work of art under German copyright law jurisdiction. That was in 1985. This doesn't feel as being long ago, although it is, but it's quite late. So photography came late to the copyright party in that regard. And for all the other developments, I fear that it is similar, that the legal processing of these culturally extremely complex questions will take time. I hope not 150 years as in the case of photography, but we don't have that time. And we have these paradigmatic developments that we can share and build upon, in my view. So we won't need that time, but it will take more time than expected, because law is culturally quite a slow mover.
Thank you for your answer. I have a question from Christian. One moment, I can't see the full name. Christian Bölling. Again, it's easier if you just type a Q in the chat function. So please go ahead.
Yes, thanks. In your presentation, you mentioned two different, or even three different principal types: data, capta, and the one that you propose in addition.
The multiplicanda,
The multiplicanda. So I wonder, given that all these items are based on some intervention with the world, be it our perceptive organs and senses, or be it sophisticated analytical techniques, what is the significance of these three different categories? And do you also, from a legal perspective, see principal differences between these three categories and on this general level of distinction?
Yes, if one could look at these three elements as being part of a process. So I have the data, I have to catch them, and then I have to process them, and I multiply them, I distribute them. And as you said, this all involves human intervention or even other algorithmic intervention. What data means is at one end of that process that is conceptually the most remote from this kind of intervention, which also means that if we imagine a pure set of data, we can expect that not so many human beings or persons have what I call this right to have their, or to have their say, the Mitspracherecht in the processing of that data. That starts as soon as we have the human factor, because there are these different ties to the different stages of that process that go back to individuals or collectives even. So if we have that, that's the concept that Talbot proposed for photographs. If we have a set of data without human intervention, we don't have the legal tools to control them, because they are just as free as something that is part of nature. And this is a very, very old argument. If we look at the 16th century, actually, we had artists compiling books of plants and drawing them. So they copied nature. And there was one publisher who sued another one because the drawings of plants had been copied from his book. And the argument was, hey, but sorry, the argument was, but this, I'm just copying nature here. This is what the plant looks like. But the two draftsmen had intervened at different stages of that process. One had taken the copy from nature, the other one had taken the copy from a copy. And there he was not in the relation between man and nature, which is also subject to legal propositions, of course, but not as a set of data that is further processed. That becomes legally complicated because there's so many people, like too many cooks in the kitchen, which is the German phrase for it. So that's when things become legally complicated or interesting. If you link data to individuals under a legally relevant regime, that can be either something like copyright, patent law, trademark, or something more collective like privacy, data protection, or even biodiversity treaties, international treaties.
Okay, so thank you very much for these insights again. I think it's really interesting to also hear like the background of legal argumentation, to see also like the philosophical background of this legal process. Simon has a question.
Hello, thank you. Just to follow up on your previous response, when you mentioned about data being that which is sort of separate from human intervention, would not the I guess it's more kind of hypothetical, would not the capture of the data be an interpretation of what is important to know? So in that respect, could you foresee, if that were the case, say, for example, a researcher claiming the data that they've collected as a copyrightable item, even though it's collected about other people because it's to do with the personality of the researcher and what they thought was worthwhile existing?
Yeah, that would be the Columbus response to capturing data. So like everybody's ignored this data, but I found how important it is, and then I have my name attached to this particular kind of, well, yeah, capture interpretation. I totally agree that the choice of data to be captured, this capta moment that Johanna Drucker is referring to, is already part of a proposition about relevance, and that's also why if yeah, like thinking like Columbus, one could say, this is kind of my data. I discovered it, or I discovered its importance, or I realized its importance. It's only that from a legal point of view, it's not enough to protect that special relationship between the discovering individual and the data. It needs to be processed in a certain way that makes it legally protectable. So philosophically, I'd say 100% yes. Legally, I'd have to give a different answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question or remark? So I can't see any more questions or remarks. So I just hand over back to Jörg again.
Thank you very much. Thanks again to the speaker, to Grischka. A little applause here, not only virtual, but also literally. And this brings us to our traditional session on the WonderMe tool, which is kind of an afterglow event where you can meet the speaker and meet also team members from NFDI, and usually also meet participants from the lecture. It is a great occasion and opportunity to have some more informal questions and just to talk about anything you want to. So please feel free to join our after talk in WonderMe. And thank you very much for today's attendance. We will have the next InfraTalk on the 7th of June, 2021. And there, Consort SVD and NFDI for Health jointly together will do a presentation on COVID-19 challenges and issues. I'm very much looking forward to that one, of course. Thank you very much for attending and for your presence and audience. And I'm looking forward to meeting you at WonderMe as well. Thank you, Grischka. Bye-bye.
See you later.